Hey guys, tonight we're taking you on a time travel journey that's definitely not going to be as glamorous as Russell Crowe sold you in Gladiator. Before you get comfortable with your tea or coffee, and by the way, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from, dim the lights, get cozy, but not too cozy, because what I'm about to tell you tonight will probably make your sleep more restless than you expected. If you like this video, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your nightmares in the comments. Before you get too comfortable, you need to know this. The Roman Empire wasn't a place for weaklings, sensitive souls, or people who think a bad day means your Wi-Fi router isn't working. No, my friends, we're talking about an empire that existed for over 1,500 years because it was damn good at breaking, molding, and using people like disposable objects. Tonight we're diving deep into the brutal, unglamorous reality of what it would have really meant to survive in the Roman Empire, not as an emperor, not as a wealthy patrician, but as what you most likely would have been, a regular person trying not to die. Let's forget the Hollywood romance for a moment. Let's forget the marble-white toga-wearing philosophers pondering life in manicured gardens. Let's forget the heroic gladiators fighting for glory and honor. That's bullshit, people. Pure, distilled bullshit. The reality? The Roman Empire was a gigantic 500-year-long meat grinder, and you would most likely have been the meat. Let's first establish the geographical and temporal framework before we send you into this hell. We're talking about an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from Germany to North Africa. An empire that existed from 27 BC to 1453 AD, though we're focusing mainly on the empire's heyday today, roughly 100 to 300 AD. This is when Rome was at its absolute peak, but also when life for the average citizen was at its harshest. The Roman Empire wasn't a homogeneous entity. It was a patchwork of conquered peoples, oppressed cultures, and a complex hierarchy designed to concentrate power in the hands of a tiny elite. Picture this: 60 million people at the empire's peak, and maybe 1% of them had a life that even remotely resembled what we'd call pleasant today. But before we get into details, let me make one thing clear. You wouldn't be born as a Roman citizen. The odds of that are about 1 in 10. More likely you'd come into this world as a slave, freedman, or member of a conquered people. And even if you had the luck to be born a Roman citizen, that didn't automatically mean a good life. It just meant you'd have to endure different kinds of shit. The Roman climate of power was permeated by a constant atmosphere of paranoia and violence. Emperors were regularly murdered. Of 27 emperors between Augustus and Diocletian, only 7 died natural deaths. If even the most powerful men in the world weren't safe, what do you think your chances would have been? The provinces of the empire were like giant prisons, where entire peoples were systematically exploited. Gaul was so thoroughly plundered that it took centuries to recover. Egypt was turned into a giant granary, while the native population starved. Britain was controlled with an occupying army, ready to drown any form of resistance in blood. In Hispania, entire mountain ranges were torn down to get at the silver and gold that Rome needed for its endless wars. The locals were driven as forced laborers into these mines, where they toiled under inhuman conditions until they died. A mine worker's life expectancy was about 2 years. The famous Pax Romana, Roman peace, was actually a system of total control through overwhelming military superiority. Peace reigned only because any resistance was immediately and brutally crushed. It was the peace of the graveyard, the silence of oppression. So, get ready. We're sending you back to 150 AD now, somewhere near Rome. You're an average inhabitant of the empire, and your goal is simple: survive more than 1 day. Spoiler alert, this is going to be harder than you think. The nightmare of awakening, you wake up, and the first thing that hits you is the stench. Not the gentle scent of lavender or freshly baked bread, no, it's the overwhelming choking smell of human feces, rotting food scraps, unwashed sweat, and the sickly sweet aroma of meat that's been lying in the sun for days. This smell is so intense that it burns into your clothes, your hair, your skin. It will accompany you all day until you no longer notice it, not because it's gone, but because your sense of smell has capitulated from overload. You open your eyes, and the first realization of the day is, you're not lying in a comfortable bed with soft sheets, you're lying on a thin straw mattress that's so old and rotten it harbors more vermin than straw. The mattress. if you can call it that, is a collection of rags, animal hair and whatever else could serve as filling material. It's hard as a board and has taken the shape of your body, but in the most painful way possible. The walls around you aren't made of stone or marble, as you might know from movies. They're thin, poorly plastered walls of an insula, a Roman apartment block built so high and unstable that it could collapse at any moment. The walls are damp, moldy, and cracked. You can hear conversations, screaming, crying, and other more intimate sounds from neighboring apartments, as if the people were right next to you. And guess what? That happens regularly too. The collapsing, I mean. Roman building codes were about as strict as safety regulations in a Chinese fireworks factory. Contractors used the cheapest materials they could find and saved on everything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Foundations were laid shallow and unstable. Walls were built thin and weak. And upper floors were simply stacked on top of each other without regard for structural integrity. The result? Insula regularly collapsed, often in the middle of the night, burying dozens of families beneath them. The survivors then had the pleasure of digging their dead relatives out of the rubble, if they even had the time and resources to do so. Most of the time, the bodies were simply left lying there until the stench became so unbearable that someone else had to deal with it. You can already hear the chaos of the city. Carts rumble over uneven cobblestones, their wheels squeaking and screeching on the rough stone. Merchants shout their wares, not with the cheerful energy of modern market vendors, but with the desperate intensity of people who know they'll starve if they don't sell. Their calls blend into a deafening cacophony that echoes and amplifies in the narrow house canyons. Children cry, but it's not the normal crying of children who want attention. It's the heartbreaking crying of children who are hungry, who are in pain, who are afraid. It's a sound that drills into your soul and stays there long after the children have fallen silent. Adults argue, their voices rising to dangerous pitches. These disputes often end in violence, a knife thrust, a blow with a stick, a fall downstairs. Life is so cheap and frustration so great that people kill and are killed over the smallest provocations. And somewhere in the distance, you hear the unmistakable sound of metal on flesh. Someone is conducting a public execution, or a gladiator fight has begun, or someone is being flogged. These sounds are so commonplace that they're part of the city's background noise. In Rome, sounds of violence were as normal as traffic noise is today. You stand up, and your feet touch the cold, dirty floor. The floor of your apartment isn't made of polished marble or even clean wooden planks. It's packed clay, interspersed with everything that's been stepped into over the years. Food scraps, bodily fluids, dead insects, animal feces. The floor is uneven and full of holes where dirt and vermin collect. Shoes, if you're lucky, you own a pair of sandals that have more holes than leather. These sandals are made from the cheapest material, often from scraps that others have thrown away. The soles are thin and offer no protection against sharp stones, shards, or the countless other dangers of Roman streets. The straps are rough and chafe your skin until they leave bloody wounds. More likely, you go barefoot and hope not to step in one of the countless piles of shit that decorate Rome's streets like deadly landmines. These piles don't just come from animals. People simply emptied their chamber pots out of windows onto the street. There were laws against this, but they were so consistently ignored that they practically didn't exist. But that's not the worst thing you can find on the street. There are also corpses, people who died in the night and were simply left lying there. Sometimes they're homeless people who froze or starved to death. Sometimes they're murder victims who were robbed and left behind. Sometimes they're plague victims whose bodies no one wants to touch. These corpses are often not removed for days until they're so decomposed that the stench overwhelms even the most hardened city dwellers. Then they're loaded onto carts by slaves and thrown into mass graves outside the city, without ceremony, without dignity, without even an attempt at identification. The daily struggle for survival, your first thought might be, I need something to eat. Bad news, my friend. Breakfast as we know it doesn't exist. The concept of 3 meals a day is a modern luxury that only the richest could afford. Most people ate once a day, if they were lucky. If they were unlucky, they didn't eat at all. If you're lucky, you get a piece of stale bread that's so hard you have to soak it in water or cheap wine to make it even chewable. This bread, by the way, isn't the fluffy white stuff you know from the supermarket. It's dark, grainy, full of impurities, and sometimes even stretched with sawdust to get more volume. The grain this bread is made from is often already spoiled before it's processed. Mold, insects, and mouse droppings are normal components. The millers didn't care about quality control. They ground anything that even remotely looked like grain. Sometimes they even mixed in chalk or sand to increase the weight and make more profit. The bread is often baked in bakeries that also serve as brothels. The workers who knead your bread are the same ones who offer their other services afterward. Hygiene is an unknown concept, and the ovens are heated with anything that burns, including garbage, animal dung, and sometimes even human remains. But wait, it gets better. You don't have a refrigerator, a stove, or a microwave. Most inhabitants of the insulae had no cooking facilities at all, because open fire in these wood and straw shacks meant a death sentence. The walls were so dry, and the spaces so cramped, that a single spark could set an entire row of houses on fire. Rome regularly burned down, by the way. The Great Fire under Nero was just one of many. Most fires started from cooking fires that got out of control. If your building burned down, you hadn't just lost your home, you were also responsible for damage to neighboring buildings and had to pay compensation that would put you in debt for the rest of your life. So you have to go to one of the public cookshops where food of questionable quality is sold at inflated prices. These cookshops, called thermopolia, are small dirty holes in the wall where food is cooked in large pots and kept warm for hours. The meat is often already rotten when it goes into the pot, and hours of cooking doesn't make it better, just hides the taste of decay. The cooks are mostly slaves or freedmen who have no training in hygiene or preparation. They use the same water for cooking, cleaning, and their personal needs. The pots are never properly cleaned, just superficially wiped before the next dish goes in. The oil the food is prepared in is reused for weeks until it becomes rancid and toxic. The salt is often stretched with sand and other impurities. The spices come from distant lands and have often gotten wet, moldy, or infested with vermin on the journey. The labyrinth of despair. The streets you have to traverse are a nightmare in themselves. Picture this: narrow winding alleys so cramped that two carts can't pass each other. When two carts meet, one has to back up until a spot is wide enough, which often means several city blocks. This leads to constant traffic jams, arguments, and outbreaks of violence. The ground is a mixture of cobblestones, mud, urine, feces, and everything people drop or throw away. The cobblestones are irregular and slippery, especially when wet. Between them collects all kinds of refuse, rotting food scraps, dead animals, human excrement, vomit. There's no street lighting, so every corner is a potential ambush. Robbers, fraudsters, and other shady characters lurk in the shadows of buildings. They know every corner of the city and use the labyrinth of alleys to their advantage. If you get lost, which is easy since there are no street signs, you quickly find yourself in areas you might never escape from. The buildings tower high above you and block most of the sunlight. Even in broad daylight, many alleys are in gloomy twilight. The upper floors of the insulae jut so far over the street that they almost touch, creating tunnel-like passages that mean claustrophobic confinement and constant danger from falling objects. People throw everything possible out of their windows, not just excrement, but also broken pottery, rotten food, dead rats, anything they want to get rid of. There's a law that says you have to shout "Aqua" first to warn passersby, but this is mostly ignored. If something hits and injures you, you have no way to claim damages unless you can prove who it was, which is practically impossible. The few wider streets aren't much better. They're clogged with carts, carriages, litters of the rich, herds of animals being driven to market, and crowds of people making their way through the chaos. The crush is so dense that you often need minutes to advance just a few yards. In this crush, thieves are particularly active. They cut purses, steal anything not firmly anchored, and disappear into the crowd before you notice what happened. Pickpocketing is an art form, and the best thieves can steal the clothes off your body without you noticing. Beggars line the streets, but these aren't the harmless figures who politely ask for alms. Many of them are violent and aggressive. They tear at your clothes, follow you, curse you if you don't give anything. Some are organized in gangs that control entire street sections and extort protection money from passers-by. The poisoned life elixir. And then there's the matter of water. You might have heard of the famous Roman aqueducts, impressive engineering masterpieces that brought fresh water to the city. That's true, but here's the catch. This water only reached the wealthy neighborhoods. The aqueducts led water to public fountains, baths, and springs, but mainly in districts where the well-off lived. In the poor neighborhoods where you live, you have to get your water from public wells that are often contaminated. These wells are fed by the same underground sources that also take in the city's sewage. The water is cloudy, tastes metallic, and of all kinds of other stuff you'd rather not identify. The problem is that the Romans didn't understand the concept of watersheds. They often dug their wells and their latrines next to each other, not knowing that groundwater connects both. The result was that you were often literally drinking the diluted sewage of your neighbors. But even the clean water from the aqueducts wasn't safe. The pipes were made of lead, a material the Romans prized for its durability and malleability, not knowing it was extremely toxic. Lead slowly dissolves in water and accumulates in the body, where it causes chronic poisoning. The symptoms of lead poisoning, headaches, stomach pains, confusion, aggressive outbursts, were so common among the Roman upper class that some historians speculate they contributed to the madness and cruelty for which Roman emperors were notorious. If even the rich, who had the best water, were being poisoned, imagine what that meant for those who got the worst. The public water points were also places of danger. Women who went to fetch water were exposed to sexual harassment and rape. Children sent to fetch water sometimes disappeared without a trace, sold into slavery, or worse. Disputes over the order at the well often ended in violence. Water had to be carried over long distances in heavy jugs or buckets. For a family of 4 or 5 people, this meant several trips per day, each of which could take hours. Water became precious and was used for everything: drinking, cooking, washing, cleaning. It was reused until it was so polluted that even the most hardened Romans couldn't use it anymore. The toilets of horror. Oh yes, and before I forget, toilets. You don't have a private toilet. That's a luxury only the wealthiest patricians could afford, and even they often shared their latrines with their slaves and servants. You have to go to the public latrines, where you sit on a stone bench that you share with dozens of other people. These public latrines aren't the clean, well-ventilated facilities you might imagine. They're dark, stinking holes, often underground or in the lower floors of buildings. The toilets are simply holes in stone benches mounted over a channel with flowing water, if you're lucky, or over a stinking cesspit. There are no partitions, no privacy. You sit side by side with strangers while you all attend to your most intimate needs. The atmosphere is filled with stench, groaning, the splashing of bodily fluids, and occasional conversations. Yes, some people treated the latrine like a social meeting place. The only thing you have for cleaning is a sponge on a stick that sits in a bucket of salt water, the same sponge that everyone before you has used. This sponge is a breeding ground for every imaginable disease. It's never properly cleaned, just briefly swished in the salt water before the next person uses it. The diseases that spread this way are varied and deadly. Cholera, dysentery, typhus, various parasites, all waiting to be transmitted from one user to the next. Many people became seriously ill after visiting the public latrine, and many died from infections they caught there. But that's not all. The latrines were also places of crime. Robbers lurked in dark corners and robbed people who were in the vulnerable position of relieving themselves. Sexual assaults were common. Murderers disposed of bodies by throwing them into the sewage channels. The channels under the latrines didn't flow to modern treatment plants, but directly into rivers or the sea. In Rome, everything flowed into the Tiber, which thereby became a toxic sewer. The stench of the river was so intense that people who lived near it developed chronic respiratory problems. Sometimes the gases that accumulated in these channels exploded. Methane and other flammable gases produced during the decomposition of organic matter could be ignited by a single spark. These explosions often killed people who were just using the latrine and set entire buildings on fire. Hygiene was a luxury only the rich could afford. For the average citizen, physical cleanliness meant a battle against overwhelming circumstances, dirty water, expensive soap, no privacy, and constant danger. The work hell of everyday life. Now that you understand the basics of Roman daily life, let's talk about your work. You're not a senator, not a patrician, not a wealthy merchant. You're probably a craftsman, a day laborer, a small trader, or, if you're really unlucky, a slave. Your work begins at sunrise and ends at sunset, 6 days a week. There's no paid vacation, no health insurance, no pension. Let's say you're a blacksmith. You stand all day in front of a glowing hot forge, breathing toxic fumes and striking red-hot metal with heavy hammers. The heat is so intense that your skin becomes like leather, cracked and burned from countless sparks and splashes of molten metal. Your hands are a patchwork of blisters, calluses, and healed burns. The workshop is a small, stuffy room without proper ventilation. The smoke from the forge has nowhere to go, so you breathe it in, hour after hour, day after day. Your lungs fill with coal dust, metal particles, and toxic gases. After a few years in this job, you develop chronic respiratory problems, a wheezing cough that keeps you awake at night and slowly but surely destroys your lungs. The iron you work with is of poor quality, full of impurities and weak spots. It breaks unexpectedly and sends glowing splinters in all directions. Your eyes are constantly in danger of injury, and many blacksmiths go partially or completely blind. The tools are primitive and wear out quickly. You constantly have to repair or replace them, which comes out of your already meager wages. Hammers break, tongs bend, and the forge must constantly be fed with expensive fuel. But hey, at least you have work, right? That's more than many others can say. Unemployment is high, and every day dozens of people stand in front of your workshop, ready to take your job for half the wages. Or maybe you're a construction worker. You lug heavy stones, mix mortar with bare hands, and work at dizzying heights without any safety equipment. The stones are rough and sharp-edged, and they cut into your hands until they're a bloody mess. The mortar is caustic and eats through your skin, leaving painful wounds that heal slowly. You work on scaffolding made of tied-together branches and ropes. These constructions are wobbly and unsafe, and strong wind, or even just a clumsy movement can bring them down. Work accidents are so common that they surprise no one. A wrong step, a falling stone, a collapsing scaffold, and your history. Working conditions vary with the weather, but they're always extreme. In summer, you work under the blazing sun, without shade, without enough water. Heat stroke and dehydration are constant dangers. In winter, you work in freezing cold. Your fingers become numbed and clumsy, which increases the risk of accidents even more. If you get injured, there's no health insurance, no ambulance, no paid sick leave. You keep working, or you starve. Simple bone fractures heal poorly and leave you crippled. Deep wounds get infected and can lead to blood poisoning and death. The construction sites are chaotic and disorganized. There are no safety regulations, no helmets, no warning signs. Materials are stacked everywhere, often unstable and dangerous. Tools lie around where anyone can trip over them. Communication between workers is poor, leading to misunderstandings and accidents. But wait, there are more joys of Roman work life. Unions, non-existent. Workers' rights. What's that? If your boss decides he doesn't need you anymore, you're out. Without warning, without severance pay, without unemployment benefits. You have to immediately find new work, or you end up on the street. Competition for jobs is brutal. Slaves work for free, which drives down wages for free workers. Why should someone pay a free worker when they can have slaves who do the same work without wages? Many free workers find themselves caught in a vicious cycle. They can't earn enough to survive, but they also can't find better work because they have to compete with slave labor. Working hours are merciless. You work from sunrise to sunset, sometimes even longer if the job requires it. There are no 8-hour days, no coffee breaks, no lunch breaks. You eat when you can, and rest when work allows, which is seldom. Physical exhaustion is constant and cumulative. Your body wears out quickly under the constant hard work. Joints ache, muscles cramp, and constant fatigue makes you susceptible to illness and accidents. But perhaps the worst thing is the mental burden. You know you're trapped in a situation with no way out. You'll never get rich, never advance, never have a better life. You only work to survive, and you only survive to work. It's an endless cycle of despair that's only broken by death or total exhaustion. The social prison, and speaking of the street, homelessness was a mass phenomenon in Rome. Thousands of people lived on the streets, in ruins, under bridges, or in the catacombs outside the city. These people were treated by the rest of society as less than animals. They were regularly rounded up and either enslaved or simply killed to keep the streets clean. So yeah, the working world in ancient Rome wasn't a place for weak nerves. But that's just the beginning of your daily challenges. Let's talk about social life. Rome was a strictly hierarchical society, and everyone knew exactly where they stood in this hierarchy. At the top were the emperor and his family. Then came the senators, the patricians, the knights, the Roman citizens, the Latins, the peregrini foreigners with limited rights, the freedmen, and at the very bottom, the slaves. This hierarchy wasn't just theoretical, it determined every aspect of your life. Your clothing, your language, your movements, even the way you walked had to reflect your social status. A violation of these unwritten rules could lead to public humiliation, physical punishment, or worse consequences. As an average inhabitant of the empire, you stand somewhere in the lower half of this pyramid. That means practically everyone has the right to treat you badly. A patrician can insult, beat, or even kill you on the open street, and the probability that he'll be prosecuted for it is vanishingly small. Roman justice worked on the principle: the higher your social status, the fewer laws apply to you. This arbitrariness of the powerful was omnipresent. You could become a victim of a rich man's whims at any time. If a patrician's wife takes a liking to you, and you dare to look at her, you could be flogged or killed. If you accidentally touch a senator's toga, you could be sold as a slave. If your craft product doesn't please a knight, he could not only refuse payment, but also have your workshop destroyed. But even within your own social class, life was one big struggle. Competition was brutal and omnipresent. Everyone tried to advance at others' expense, or at least not fall further down. Trust was a luxury no one could afford. Friendships were rare, and mostly superficial, because you never knew when your best friend would betray you for a few coins. The social codes were complex and unforgiving. You had to know exactly how to behave toward people of different ranks. The wrong greeting, the wrong word, the wrong gesture, all of this could plunge you into ruin. The rich expected submissiveness, but not too much, or they would despise you. They wanted respect, but not groveling. The line between acceptable and unacceptable behavior was thin and constantly changing. Rumors and gossip were powerful weapons in this society. A false accusation, a malicious rumor, a made-up story, all of this could destroy your life. People deliberately destroyed others' reputations to make themselves look better. Slander was an art form, and the most skilled could destroy careers and lives with a few well-placed words. The family prison. The family also offered no safe haven. The paterfamilias, the male head of household, had absolute power over all family members. This wasn't just a tradition, but a legal right supported by the state. He could decide whether newborn children should live or die, a practice called exposure, where unwanted babies were simply left outside the city to die or be eaten by wild animals. This practice was so common that there were entire business sectors that specialized in it. Baby farmers collected exposed children to sell them as slaves, or use them for other shady purposes. The few who were lucky were adopted by childless couples, but even this was often just a form of slavery by another name. The paterfamilias could sell his children, divorce his wife, and kill his slaves at will. Violence in the family was not only accepted, but was considered necessary for maintaining order. Children were regularly beaten, not just for punishment, but also for character building. Women could be beaten, imprisoned, or even killed by their husbands if they were considered disobedient. Marriage wasn't a romantic union, but a business contract between families. Love was a luxury only the rich could afford, and even then it was secondary to political and economic considerations. Young girls were often married at age 12 or 13 to much older men they had never seen before. These young brides were torn from their families and brought to strange households where they were completely subject to the whims of their new master, because that's what the husband was in reality. Many died in childbirth because their bodies weren't yet mature enough for pregnancy. Those who survived spent their lives bearing and raising children, often under the most primitive conditions. Women had virtually no rights. They couldn't vote, hold political office, conduct business, and were legally treated like minor children. A woman passed from her father's ownership to her husband's ownership. She couldn't own property, make contracts, or testify in court, except in rare, special circumstances. Divorce was easy for men. They just had to say, "I divorce you." But practically impossible for women unless they had the support of their birth family, which was rare. A divorced woman had few options. Return to her birth family if they would accept her. Remarry, unlikely, especially if she was older, or live as a beggar or prostitute. Even within the family, a woman was never safe. Domestic violence was not only legal, but was considered a man's right. Wives could be beaten, raped, imprisoned, or killed by their husbands without anyone intervening. Society viewed such acts as private matters that the state shouldn't interfere with. Children had even fewer rights than women. Child labor was normal and accepted. Children worked in mines, workshops, fields, and households, often under conditions that would be considered torture today. Education was a privilege of the rich, and most children never learned to read or write. Child mortality was so high that many parents didn't name their children until after their second birthday, because the probability of survival before then was too low. Of 10 children born, often only 3 or 4 survived to adulthood. Diseases, malnutrition, accidents, and violence swept them away before they had a chance to live. Let's be honest, Roman family life wasn't a place of warmth and security. It was another survival strategy in a world designed to crush the weak. The illusion of leisure. But maybe you're thinking, well, daily life is hard, but at least I can relax in my free time, right? Oh, my sweet naive friend. Leisure time as we know it didn't exist for the average citizen. After a 12-hour workday, you were too exhausted to do anything but eat and sleep. But let's say you had a free day, maybe a religious holiday, or a day when no work was available. What could you do? Well, you could go to the games, the famous gladiator fights, chariot races, or public executions. These events were free because they were financed by the state or wealthy citizens to keep the people content, the classic bread and circuses principle. But here's the thing. This entertainment was incredibly brutal. Gladiator fights often ended with the death of one or both fighters. These weren't the choreographed fights you know from movies. These were real people mutilating and killing each other with sharp weapons, while thousands of spectators cheered and demanded more blood. The gladiators themselves were mostly slaves, prisoners of war, or those condemned to death who had no choice. They didn't fight for glory or honor, but to live another day. Many were so mutilated from previous fights that they barely looked human anymore. Missing limbs, disfigured faces, deep scars. These were the trademarks of gladiators. At executions, people were killed in the most creative and agonizing ways. Crucified, torn apart by wild animals, burned alive, or quartered. The audience cheered at every scream of pain, at every splash of blood. The more cruel the execution, the more the spectators applauded. It was a society that delighted in torture and death. The famous damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the wild beasts, was a particularly popular spectacle. People were thrown unarmed into the arena, where hungry lions, tigers, bears, or other predators waited for them. The animals were often not fed for days to increase their aggressiveness. The death struggles could last for hours, while the audience enjoyed the details. Sometimes entire battles were reenacted with hundreds of prisoners who had to kill each other. These naumachia, reenacted sea battles, took place in flooded arenas, where people not only drowned, but were also attacked by crocodiles and other aquatic animals. Chariot races in the Circus Maximus were also deadly, but in a different way. Drivers were regularly trampled, horses broke their necks, and spectators in the front rows were sometimes struck by flying wagon parts. The racers were mostly slaves, or very poor free men willing to risk their lives for a bit of glory and the chance of wealth. Most died young and brutally. Chariot racing wasn't just dangerous because of speed and competition, it was also corrupt. Drivers were bribed, threatened, or poisoned. Rivals sabotaged each other's chariots. The audience bet huge sums and became violent when their favorites lost. But it was the only thing that distracted from daily misery, so people went and hoped they wouldn't become part of the entertainment themselves. The arenas were dangerous places, even for spectators. Collapsing stands, panic in the crowd, fights between rival fan sections, all of this regularly claimed lives. In short, Roman leisure was designed to remind people that life was cheap, and death was omnipresent. The medical martyrdom. Now let's talk about a particularly important topic, health and medicine. If you got sick in ancient Rome, you were basically fucked. Roman medicine was based on a mixture of primitive surgical techniques, magical rituals, and completely false ideas about how the human body works. The doctors, if you can call them that, had no real medical training. Most were slaves or freedmen who had acquired their knowledge through trial and error, mostly by killing their patients. There were no medical schools, no certifications, no standards. Anyone could call themselves a doctor and start treating people. The prevailing medical theory was based on the doctrine of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believed that diseases were caused by an imbalance of these humors. Treatment usually consisted of weakening the patient until balance was restored. This meant bloodletting, laxatives, emetics, and other torture techniques sold as medicine. Bloodletting was the universal treatment for practically every disease. Fever, bloodletting. Headache, bloodletting. Broken leg, bloodletting. Doctors opened veins with dirty knives, or applied leeches that often transmitted more diseases than they cured. Many patients didn't. Bloodletting was the universal treatment for practically every disease. Fever, bloodletting. Headache, bloodletting. Broken leg, bloodletting. Doctors opened veins with dirty knives, or applied leeches that often transmitted more diseases than they cured. Many patients didn't die from their original illness, but from blood loss through the treatment. Surgery was even worse. There was no anesthesia except alcohol or opium, if available. Most surgical procedures were performed while fully conscious, with assistants holding down the screaming patient. The surgical instruments weren't sterilized. The concept of germ theory was completely unknown. Infections were practically inevitable. A simple wound could lead to blood poisoning and death. Doctors didn't understand why wounds became infected, so they treated them with everything possible: animal dung, rotting plants, human urine. These treatments only made the infections worse. Toothaches were treated by pulling out the tooth, without anesthesia, of course. The tooth pullers used primitive pliers that often did more damage than necessary. Many people died from infections that spread from tooth wounds. Broken bones were rarely treated properly. The bones were simply put together and fixed with splints, without x-rays or other ways to check if they were properly aligned. Most fractures healed poorly and left people crippled and in chronic pain. Women who became pregnant put their lives in danger. Maternal mortality was extremely high. About 50% of women died in childbirth or shortly after from infections. The midwives were mostly ignorant women who relied more on superstition than medical knowledge. When a baby had problems during birth, usually the mother was sacrificed to save the child, or vice versa, depending on what the man of the family considered more important. Caesarean sections were only performed on dead mothers to try to save the baby. A woman who survived a caesarean section was practically unknown. Many children died at birth or shortly after. Infant mortality was about 50%. Of those who survived birth, another 30% died before their 5th birthday. The main causes of death were infections, malnutrition, and neglect. Mental illnesses were seen as possession or punishment from the gods. Treatment consisted of exorcism, torture, or simply locking people away. People with depression, anxiety, or other psychological problems were considered cursed and shunned by society. People with disabilities were seen as a curse and often exposed as children or killed. Those who reached adulthood were exploited as beggars or street performers. Blind, deaf, or physically disabled people had no opportunities to live normal lives. And then there were the plagues. The Roman Empire was regularly swept by epidemics: plague, smallpox, typhus, cholera, tuberculosis. These diseases swept through the overcrowded cities like fire through dry grass. When a plague broke out, the only treatment was praying to the gods and hoping you weren't next. Quarantine was unknown. Sick people weren't isolated but continued to live among the healthy and spread their diseases. Hygiene was practically non-existent, and diseases spread like wildfire. Entire neighborhoods could be depopulated within weeks. The famous Antonine Plague, 165 Mycid 180 AD, killed an estimated 10% of the empire's population. People died so quickly that there weren't enough living people to bury the dead. Corpses lay in the streets and rotted in the sun, which only made the plague worse. Oh yeah, and if you think at least the rich had better medical care, not really. They too died from diseases that today would be curable with a simple antibiotic. The only difference was they died in more comfortable beds and could afford more expensive quacks. In short, getting sick in ancient Rome was often a death sentence. Medicine wasn't just useless. It was often more dangerous than the disease itself. The devil of superstition. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about the religious and superstitious aspects of Roman life. The Romans were extremely superstitious and saw omens, curses, and divine signs everywhere. Every aspect of life was permeated with religious rituals and superstitions that made life even more complicated and dangerous. Before you could leave the house, you had to pray to your household gods, the lares and penates. These little god statues stood in a corner of your room, and you had to bring them daily offerings: bread, wine, sometimes even blood. If you neglected these rituals, the Romans believed, the gods would curse you and bring misfortune upon you. Before you undertook anything important, you had to have the omens interpreted. Augurs, priestly fortune-tellers, read the future from the flight of birds, the entrails of sacrificial animals, or other natural phenomena. This fortune-telling wasn't cheap, and you often had to spend a considerable part of your income on it. If a bird flew in the wrong direction, if you got out of bed with your left foot, if you saw a black dog, if you stumbled over a crack in the street, all of this could mean that the gods were angry with you and you'd better spend the day in bed. But you couldn't afford to lose a day's work, so you went to work anyway, and lived in constant fear of divine retribution. It wasn't easy to keep the gods happy. There were hundreds of gods in the Roman pantheon, each with their own rituals, sacrifices, and taboos. Jupiter wanted white bulls, Mars demanded blood, Vesta needed eternal fire, Minerva wanted olive oil, Bacchus demanded wine, and so on. If you didn't know exactly which god was responsible for what, you could accidentally anger the wrong god while trying to appease another. The sacrificial animals were expensive, and for a poor person, it was practically impossible to bring the right sacrifices. You had to make do with cheaper alternatives: a chicken instead of a bull, an egg instead of a lamb. But then the priests proclaimed that the gods rejected your inferior sacrifice and demanded that you repeat it, with a more expensive animal. The priests were powerful and often corrupt figures who used their position to enrich themselves. They sold blessings, curses, and prophecies to the highest bidder. If you couldn't pay enough, they declared that the gods weren't well disposed toward you. If you were unlucky, they could denounce you as a despiser of gods, which often meant a death sentence. The religious festivals, which were supposed to bring joy, were additional burdens for the poor. You had to spend money you didn't have on sacrifices you couldn't afford for gods who wouldn't help you anyway. The festivals were also dangerous. The crowds, the alcohol, the religious ecstasy often led to violence and chaos. And then there were the foreign religions spreading throughout the empire. Christianity, the Mithras cult, the Egyptian mysteries, the cult of Magna Mater. These religions were often persecuted, their followers tortured. But at the same time, they offered people hope in a hopeless world, which is why they spread despite the dangers. The early Christians, for example, were regularly thrown to the lions, crucified, or used as living torches at Nero's garden parties. Their persecution was systematic and cruel. Christian families were torn apart, their children sold into slavery, their property confiscated. But they believed their suffering would be rewarded in the afterlife, which gave them the strength to endure the torture. The Mithras cult was popular among soldiers, but the initiation rites were brutal and often deadly. Candidates had to undergo bloody tests, including ritual torture and humiliation. Many died during initiation, but those who survived found a brotherhood that gave them support in a cruel world. The Egyptian mystery cults promised rebirth and eternal life, but the rites often involved drugs that led to hallucinations and sometimes permanent brain damage. The priests exploited these altered states of consciousness to manipulate and control their followers. So yeah, religion in ancient Rome wasn't the comfortable Sunday service you might know. It was a constant battle between different gods, priests, and belief systems, and you were caught in the middle, trying to survive without angering the wrong deities, or falling into the clutches of corrupt priests. The legal system of terror. But let's talk about something else, the legal system. You might think that Roman laws, which formed the basis for many modern legal systems, were at least fair and just. Roman law was only fair if you were rich and powerful. For the average citizen, the legal system was a nightmare designed to reinforce existing power relationships. For the average citizen, the legal system was a nightmare. First, you couldn't afford a lawyer. Lawyers were expensive, and the best ones only worked for the rich. The few lawyers you could afford were often incompetent or corrupt. Second, judges were often corrupt and sold their verdicts to the highest bidder. A wealthy opponent could buy the judge before the trial even began. Third, the punishments were incredibly brutal and disproportionate. Theft? Amputation of the hand or foot. Adultery? Death for the woman, a shrug for the man. Insulting an official? Public flogging, or worse. Desertion from the army? Crucifixion. And these were still the mild punishments for minor offenses. For serious crimes, there was a whole palette of execution methods designed to cause maximum pain and public humiliation. Crucifixion was just one of many options. There was also being torn apart by wild animals, being buried alive, being cooked in boiling oil, being quartered, being slowly tortured with glowing irons until death occurred. Torture was a regular part of the legal system. Confessions extracted under torture were considered completely valid. In fact, they were often the only type of evidence courts would accept. The torture methods were creative and cruel. Racks, glowing irons, thumbscrews, saws, fire, needles under fingernails, whips with metal tips. The torturers were experts at torturing people so they stayed alive, but suffered maximum pain. They knew exactly how much a human body could endure before it died, and kept their victims right at that limit. Some torture sessions lasted days, or even weeks. If you were accused, you were practically already condemned. There was no presumption of innocence as in modern legal systems. You had to prove your innocence, not the accuser had to prove your guilt. And since you couldn't afford good lawyers, and witnesses were usually bought or intimidated, It was nearly impossible to prove your innocence. There were no fair trials in the modern sense. The judge often decided before the trial began, based on who had paid more or had more political influence. The trial itself was often just theater to give the whole thing an appearance of legitimacy. There were also no appeal possibilities for ordinary citizens. The judge's verdict was final. Only very rich or politically powerful people could try to appeal to higher courts, but even that was expensive and uncertain. Prisons as we know them didn't exist. The concept of rehabilitation was completely unknown. Those convicted were either immediately executed, sentenced to forced labor, or sent to gladiator schools, which was practically the same as execution. Just slower and more profitable. The famous Mamertine prison in Rome was just temporary holding for people waiting for their execution. It was a damp, dark hole underground, where prisoners sat in their own excrement until they were brought up and killed. Forced labor usually meant work in mines or on large estates under inhuman conditions. Most died within a few years from exhaustion, disease, or abuse. It was a slow form of execution. Let's be clear, justice was a luxury only the rich could afford. For everyone else, the legal system was just another method of oppression and control, a tool to protect the powerful and crush the weak. The war machine of the empire. Now let's talk about war, a topic that affected every Roman, whether they wanted it or not. The Roman Empire was basically a gigantic war machine that constantly expanded, conquered territories, and subjugated new peoples. War wasn't just inevitable, it was the lifeblood of the empire. Without constant conquests and plundering, the empire couldn't have survived. As a male Roman citizen, you were obligated to serve in the military. This wasn't a one-year basic service like in some countries today. You had to spend 16 to 25 years in the army, practically your entire adult life sacrificing to the state to kill people in distant lands, whom you'd never seen, and who had done nothing to you. The Roman army was brutally efficient, but a soldier's life was hell on earth. Training was designed to beat every sense of individuality and compassion out of you. You were beaten, humiliated, and tortured until you became a perfect killing machine. Recruitment itself was often a form of kidnapping. Poor young men were taken from the streets, or torn from their villages, and pressed into the legion. If you tried to flee, you were hunted as a deserter, and if caught, publicly executed. Basic training lasted months, and was designed to break you physically and mentally. You had to march 30th kilometers every day, in full armor, with heavy equipment. You had to learn to fight with various weapons, sword, spear, bow, sling. You had to learn to follow orders without thinking. Discipline in the army was inhuman. If a unit failed in battle, every 10th soldier was selected by lot and beaten to death by his own comrades, the famous decimation. If you deserted and were caught, you were crucified. If you threw away your weapon in battle, you were publicly flogged and expelled from the army, which was practically a death sentence, since you had no livelihood without the military. If you refused an order, you were immediately executed. If you were late for guard duty, you were flogged. If you were caught sleeping while supposed to be on watch, you were stoned. The army tolerated no weakness, no humanity, no individuality. The campaigns took you to the most remote corners of the known world. You marched through German forests where barbarian tribes attacked from ambush. You fought in the burning heat of the African desert against Nubian warriors. You climbed the icy passes of the Scottish Highlands to hunt Picts who painted their faces blue and went naked into battle. You fought against Gallic druids who filled their warriors with magic and fear. You battled Parthian horsemen who shot poisoned arrows and then disappeared before you could reach them. You stormed Germanic fortresses that were riddled with traps and obstacles, but the fighting itself was only part of the horror. The marches between battles were just as deadly. You had to cover 30 to 40 kilometers on foot daily, in full armor with heavy equipment. Your gear weighed about 30 kilograms. Armor, weapons, tools, cookware, tent, personal items. You had to build a fortified camp every evening, dig trenches, set up palisades, post guards. This often lasted until deep into the night. and the next morning you had to tear everything down and march on. If you got sick, you still had to march, or you were left behind and died alone in the wilderness. There were no ambulances, no field hospitals, no medical care except a primitive doctor who usually did more harm than good. The food was bad and often contaminated. You lived mainly on hard biscuits, rancid bacon, sour milk, and whatever you could find in the countryside. Clean water was rare, and dysentery, typhus, and other diseases claimed more soldiers than enemy weapons. You had to sleep in primitive tents, often crammed together with several other soldiers. In winter you were defenseless against the cold, in summer against heat and insects. You were constantly infested with lice, fleas, and other parasites. And then there was the matter of loot. After a successful battle, soldiers were allowed to plunder, burn down cities, kill men, rape women, sell children into slavery. This wasn't just permitted, it was expected. A soldier who refused to plunder was considered weak and despised by his comrades. You had to do things that destroyed your soul. You had to kill unarmed civilians, tear babies from their mothers, break up families. You had to tear down temples, steal sacred objects, obliterate entire cultures. The psychological effects were devastating. Many soldiers developed what we would call post-traumatic stress disorder today. They had nightmares, flashbacks, uncontrollable outbursts of rage. But there was no treatment, no understanding of such problems. You just had to live with it or be broken by it. In short, Roman military service was 16 to 25 years of hell on earth. And if you survived, you were a broken man, traumatized by years of violence and killing. The fate of the conquered, but maybe you weren't a Roman citizen. Maybe you were a member of a conquered people. In that case, your fate was even worse. The Romans practiced what we would call ethnic cleansing today. Entire peoples were exterminated, displaced, or enslaved. If your tribe resisted, all adult males were killed, all women and children sold into slavery, and your land distributed to Roman veterans. If you had surrendered, you might have stayed alive, but as second or third class people who had to pay tribute to Rome for the rest of your lives. The conquest was systematic and cruel. Roman legions surrounded your villages and cities, cut off all escape routes, and then began the siege. They starved you out, poisoned your water sources, threw diseases over your walls. When the city fell, the massacre began. Roman soldiers killed indiscriminately, men, women, children, elderly, sick. They plundered everything of value, burned down what they couldn't take, and dragged the survivors into slavery. Romanization, the process by which conquered peoples were made Roman, was a systematic attempt to obliterate your culture, your language, your religion, and your identity. Your children were sent to Roman schools, where they learned to despise their own heritage and regard Rome as the highest form of civilization. Your traditional leaders were either killed or bought. Those who collaborated with Rome got privileges and wealth. Those who resisted were publicly executed to make an example. Your daughters were given in marriage to Roman citizens, which was often nothing more than legalized rape. Your land was confiscated and distributed to Roman veterans who farmed it with slaves, often with members of your own people. You became strangers in your own land, forced to work your own fields for men who had killed your families. Your language was banned, your writing destroyed, your literature burned, your religion was suppressed, your temples destroyed, your priests killed. Everything that defined you as a people was systematically obliterated. Oh yeah, and if you thought the Romans were at least tolerant toward other religions, that was only as long as these religions posed no threat to Roman authority. As soon as a religion had political implications or refused to acknowledge the Roman gods, it was brutally suppressed. The Druids in Gaul and Britain were systematically persecuted and exterminated because they represented the intellectual and spiritual center of resistance to Rome. Their sacred groves were cut down, their temples destroyed, their followers killed or enslaved. The knowledge of centuries was obliterated in a few decades. Roman soldiers made a sport of desecrating sacred places. They raped priestesses, urinated on altars, used religious artifacts as toilet paper. They knew that destroying a people's spiritual identity was the most effective way to break their resistance. The Jewish revolts were another example of Roman tolerance. After the Great Revolt of 66-73 AD, Jerusalem was razed to the ground, the temple destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of Jews killed or enslaved. The Bar Kokhba revolt of 135 AD led to an even greater massacre. The Romans killed over 500,000 people and banned Jews from even entering Jerusalem. So yeah, if you belonged to a conquered people, your life wasn't just hard, it was a constant struggle for bare survival in a world that viewed your existence as an obstacle to Roman progress. The hell of slavery. But let's talk about another important topic. Slavery. In the Roman Empire, about 30 to 40% of the population were slaves. These weren't just prisoners of war, slaves came from all kinds of sources. Children were sold by their own parents, debtors were enslaved, people were kidnapped by pirates and sold, others were enslaved as punishment for crimes. The slave markets were cruel places where people were treated like livestock. Potential buyers examined slaves like horses, opened their mouths to check their teeth, felt their muscles, forced them to run or jump to test their fitness. Women and children were often raped before sale to prove they were functional. As a slave, you were legally not a human being but an object, res, a thing. Your owner could do whatever he wanted with you. He could beat, torture, kill, sell, give away, or use you as collateral for debts. You had no rights whatsoever. Not even the right to stay alive. You couldn't marry. Any relationship between slaves was legally meaningless and could be ended by your owner at any time. Your children didn't belong to you but to your master, who could sell, give away, or kill them as he pleased. Families were routinely torn apart, parents separated from their children, spouses from each other. The working and living conditions of slaves varied greatly depending on what luck or bad luck you had. Female house slaves in wealthy families might have had a relatively bearable life. They were well fed, properly clothed, and sometimes even educated. But they were also completely sexually defenseless. Many house slaves were made into concubines, official mistresses, who had to be available for their master's sexual needs. They were treated well as long as they were young and attractive, but as soon as they aged or became ill, they were sold or killed. Even worse was the fate of mining slaves. They were driven into narrow, poorly ventilated shafts, where they dug for silver, gold, or other metals by candlelight. The work was so hard, and the conditions so inhuman, that most died within a few years from lung diseases, cave-ins, or exhaustion. The mines were practically death sentences in installments. Slaves worked 12, 16 hours a day, in complete darkness, breathing toxic gases, carrying heavy loads on their backs, crawling through narrow tunnels that could collapse at any time. Many were buried alive, others died from poisoning or exhaustion. The overseers in the mines were sadistic brutes, who enjoyed their power over the slaves. They whipped workers who were too slow, killed those who could no longer work, and invented ever new forms of torture and humiliation. Gladiator slaves had a different fate. They were well fed and trained, because they had to make money, but their lives were designed to die for others' entertainment. They fought not only against other gladiators, but also against wild animals, lions, tigers, bears, hippos. Most didn't survive longer than a few years. The gladiator schools were prisons and torture facilities at once. Gladiators were kept in chains, constantly guarded, brutally punished for any attempt at rebellion. They were trained to be killing machines, their human instincts suppressed and replaced with fighting fury. Agricultural slaves on the large latifundia perhaps had the hardest life of all. They worked from sunrise to sunset in the fields, often in chains, watched by overseers with whips. They slept in overcrowded barracks, got only the bare minimum to eat, and were treated like cattle. These slaves didn't even have names. They were identified with numbers or brands. They were hunted with dogs if they tried to escape. They were tortured and killed for their master's amusement. Their children were often killed immediately after birth to prevent the slave population from growing too quickly. Revolts were rare, but when they occurred, they were put down with indescribable brutality. The famous Spartacus revolt of 73–71 BC is a perfect example. Over 70,000 slaves joined the revolt, and for 3 years they defeated one Roman army after another. But in the end, they were defeated. 6,000 surviving rebels were crucified along the Via Appia, a 200-kilometer-long road of death that served as a warning to all other slaves. Their bodies were left hanging on the crosses for months until they rotted and were eaten by birds. Let's be honest. Slavery in ancient Rome wasn't the romanticized version sometimes shown in movies. It was industrialized dehumanization on a scale that's shocking even by today's standards. The life of the free poor, but maybe you had the luck to be born a free man. Let me tell you what that meant. You were free, yes, but that didn't mean your life was easy. As a small farmer, craftsman or trader, you were constantly in danger of impoverishment and debt. The Roman economy was designed to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. Large landowners with slave labor could sell their products so cheaply that small farmers couldn't compete. If you couldn't pay your debts, you lost your land, and might even be enslaved yourself. The system of latifundia, huge estates farmed with slave labor, destroyed traditional Roman agriculture. Small farmers who had been the backbone of the empire for centuries couldn't compete with cheap slave labor. They lost their farms, their identity, their future. If you were in debt, which was almost inevitable, you had few options. You could try to borrow more money, but interest rates were crushing, often 50% or more per year. You could use your children or wife as collateral. You could sell yourself as a slave, or you could flee and live as a bandit or beggar. Craftsmen faced competition from slave labor. Why should someone pay a free blacksmith when they could have slaves who did the same work for free? Most craftsmen lived on the edge of subsistence, and never knew if they'd have work the next day. The guilds and unions that would later protect craftsmen didn't exist yet, or were weak and ineffective. Every craftsman was on his own, in constant competition with his colleagues and with slave labor. The workshops were small, dark, poorly ventilated rooms, often in the lower floors of the insulae. Working conditions were dangerous, tools primitive, raw materials of poor quality. Accidents were frequent, and an injury could mean the end of your career. Merchants had to deal with corrupt officials, pirates, bandits, and unreliable transportation routes. A single failed trading trip could ruin you. The roads were full of dangers. Robbers lurked around every corner. Bridges collapsed. Weather could destroy your goods. There was no insurance, and if your goods were stolen or your ship sank, you were bankrupt. Many merchants tried to run multiple businesses simultaneously to spread the risk, but that also meant they spread themselves too thin and weren't really successful in any area. The markets were chaotic and unregulated. There were no standards for weights and measures, no quality controls, no guarantees. Fraud was widespread, and customers practically expected it. You had to constantly be on guard against thieves, fraudsters, and corrupt officials. Taxes were crushing and unpredictable. The Roman state financed itself mainly through exploiting its citizens. There were property taxes, income taxes, trade taxes, inheritance taxes, luxury taxes, war taxes, road taxes. The list was endless, and constantly changing. Tax collectors were notorious for their corruption and brutality. The system of publicani, private tax collectors, was designed to maximize profit. These men bought the right to collect taxes, and could keep everything they collected above the official amount. They often extorted more money than was legally owed, and kept the excess for themselves. They threatened, tortured, and killed people who couldn't pay. They confiscated property, enslaved debtors, and destroyed families. If you couldn't pay your taxes, your property was confiscated. If that wasn't enough, you were enslaved. There was no mercy, no installment payments, no social assistance. You paid or you were delivered. Corruption was omnipresent. Every official, from the lowest clerk to the highest magistrate, expected bribes. Without bribery, you couldn't get permits, couldn't conclude contracts, couldn't win legal cases. Bribery wasn't just common, it was necessary for survival. But even if you bribed, there was no guarantee you'd get what you paid for. Officials often took bribes from multiple parties and then decided in favor of whoever paid the most, or simply according to their personal whims. In short, even as a free citizen, you were just one step away from ruin. Social mobility was mainly downward, and the American dream was a completely unknown concept. The infrastructure of suffering now. Let's talk about infrastructure, the famous Roman roads, aqueducts, and public baths that are often cited as proof of Roman civilization's superiority. Yes, these structures were impressive, but they were built with the blood and sweat of millions of slaves and forced laborers. Roman roads were built mainly for military purposes, to move legions quickly and control conquered territories. For the average citizen, they were less useful. Travel was expensive, dangerous, and time-consuming. Most people never left their birthplace. If you did have to travel, you were exposed to numerous dangers. The roads were full of bandits who operated in organized gangs and robbed entire merchant caravans. They knew every ambush, every shortcut, every place where they could attack their victims. Inns were often just disguised brothels or robber dens. Innkeepers were frequently involved in conspiracies with local bandits. They drugged travelers, robbed them, and sometimes even sold them into slavery. Many travelers disappeared without a trace on Roman roads. The road police were corrupt and unreliable. Vigiles, the city watch, were often criminals themselves or were bribed by local criminal gangs. If you were robbed or murdered, nobody cared unless you were rich and powerful. The famous aqueducts did bring water to cities, but as I mentioned, the clean water mainly reached wealthy neighborhoods. In poor neighborhoods, you had to make do with contaminated well water or pay dearly for clean water. Maintaining the aqueducts was a constant challenge. They were regularly sabotaged by barbarians who wanted to weaken Roman civilization. Repairs were carried out by slaves who worked under inhuman conditions and often died on the job. The water that flowed through the aqueducts wasn't as clean as often claimed. It collected dirt, dead animals, human waste, and other contamination on its way. The lead pipes it flowed through slowly but surely poisoned it. The public baths were also mainly intended for the upper class. Yes, there were also simpler baths for ordinary people, but they were overcrowded, dirty, and often breeding grounds for disease. The water was rarely changed, and hundreds of people bathed in the same dirty water. These baths were petri dishes for every imaginable disease. Skin diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, parasites, bacterial infections, everything spread quickly in the warm, moist conditions. Many people went into the baths healthy and came out sick. Oh yeah, and the public baths were also places of prostitution, gambling, and other pleasures. If you just wanted a relaxing bath, you were in the wrong place. The baths were meeting places for criminals, prostitutes, gamblers, and other shady characters. The heating of the baths was done through hypox, a system of underground furnaces. These systems were inefficient and dangerous. Carbon monoxide poisoning was common, and the baths regularly burned down. The education system of cruelty. The education system was another area where social differences were brutally obvious. Education was a privilege of the rich. If you came from a poor family, you had no chance of formal education. You learned a trade from your father, or were used as unskilled labor. The few schools that existed were private institutions financed by wealthy families. The teachers were mostly slaves, or freedmen, who themselves had only limited education. There was no teacher training, no standards, no supervision. Even if you were lucky enough to attend school, the education system was brutal. Teachers used physical violence as the main method of discipline. Students were regularly beaten, humiliated, and abused. The motto was "Spare the rod and spoil the child." The classrooms were cold, poorly lit, and uncomfortable. There was no heating, no comfortable seating, no teaching materials, except a few old scrolls. Students sat on hard benches and wrote on wax tablets with primitive styluses. The curriculum was extremely limited and impractical. You learned Latin and Greek literature by heart, but nothing about practical skills that could help you in life. Mathematics, natural sciences, and technology were neglected. The goal of education wasn't to create critical thinkers, but obedient citizens who wouldn't question the existing order. The method of learning was rote memorization. Creativity, originality, or critical thinking weren't just not encouraged. They were actively suppressed. Students who asked too many questions or challenged the teacher's authority were brutally punished. Women were almost completely excluded from the education system. Even wealthy girls learned only the basics: reading, writing, and household management. The idea that women could have education equal to men was completely unthinkable. The little education girls received was designed to make them obedient wives and mothers. They didn't learn to think or act independently, but to obey and serve. Let's be clear. The Roman education system was designed to reinforce social hierarchies, not break them down. The poisoned feast. But let's talk about something else. Food. You might have romantic notions of Roman banquets with exotic dishes and fine wines. The reality for the average citizen was quite different. Your daily diet consisted mainly of grain porridge, hard bread, olive oil, and cheap wine. Meat was a rare luxury you might afford once a month, and then it was usually rancid bacon or tough mutton from old animals that were already beginning to die. The grain that formed the basis of your diet was often of poor quality. It was contaminated with sand, stones, insects, and mouse droppings. Mold was common, especially in damp storage. You regularly ate moldy grain without knowing it, which could lead to chronic poisoning. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal and expensive. In winter, you lived mainly on pickled or dried foods that were often moldy or rotten. Preservation methods were primitive and unreliable. Salt was expensive and often stretched with sand or other contaminant. Vitamin deficiency was widespread and led to scurvy, night blindness, bone softening, and other deficiency diseases. In winter, when fresh foods weren't available, many people developed severe deficiency symptoms. Food hygiene was practically non-existent. There was no refrigeration, no preservatives, except salt, and no quality controls. Meat was often sold after it had already begun to rot. Sellers used spices and strong sauces to mask the taste of spoiled meat. Milk and dairy products were particularly dangerous because they spoiled quickly and transmitted bacteria. Cheese was often rancid or moldy. Butter was a rare luxury that was usually already spoiled when sold. Food poisoning was so common that it was considered a normal part of life. Diarrhea, vomiting, and stomach cramps were part of daily life. Many people died from what we would consider treatable food poisoning today. The kitchens where food was prepared were dark, dirty, poorly ventilated rooms. There was no running water for cleaning, no soap, no disinfectants. Cooking and eating utensils were only superficially cleaned, and often remained contaminated with food scraps and bacteria. The drinking water was, as already mentioned, often contaminated. Wine was safer than water, but the cheap wine that normal people could afford was sour, watered down, and sometimes stretched with toxic substances. Lead compounds were used as sweeteners, leading to chronic poisoning and brain damage. The infamous sapa, a sweet syrup made by boiling grape must in lead vessels, was a popular sweetener that slowly but surely poisoned everyone who ate it. Chronic lead poisoning led to madness, violence, and premature death. In short, daily eating was a constant battle against hunger, disease, and poisoning. The housing hell now. Let's talk about housing. The famous Roman villas with mosaics, courtyards, and luxurious baths were only for the top 1% of society. You probably lived in an insula, a multi-story tenement, that was so poorly built it would be an insult to modern slums. The insula were built quickly and cheaply, mainly from wood and clay. Contractors saved on everything. Foundation, walls, roofs, everything was built as cheaply as possible. They used recycled materials that were often already rotten or damaged. They were fire hazards, structurally unstable, and completely overcrowded. A typical insula housed hundreds of people in the smallest space. You shared a single room with your entire family, sometimes even with other families. Privacy was an unknown concept. There was no running water, no toilets, no heating, no windows, except holes in the wall that could be closed with wooden shutters. In winter, you were defenseless against cold and dampness. In summer, the heat was unbearable, and the stench from too many people in too little space was overwhelming. The upper floors were the cheapest and most dangerous. The higher you lived, the greater the probability that the building would collapse or burn down. The stairs were narrow, steep, and often rickety. People regularly fell down and broke their necks. The floors were uneven and full of holes. The walls were thin and offered no protection from noise, cold, or intruders. The roofs leaked with every rain, and water collected in stinking puddles on the floor. Rats, mice, lice, fleas, and other vermin were constant roommates. They ate your supplies, transmitted diseases, and made life even more unbearable than it already was. The rats were particularly problematic. They were so large and aggressive they could attack small children and sick adults. Despite the poor conditions, rents were extremely high. Landlords ruthlessly exploited housing shortages and demanded prices that often took half your income. They knew people had no alternative and used this desperation ruthlessly. If you couldn't pay rent, you were thrown onto the street, and in Rome, homelessness practically meant a death sentence. There were no homeless shelters, no social assistance, no aid organizations. You were on your own. Oh yeah, and if you think at least the neighborhood was safe, forget it. The insulae districts were breeding grounds for crime, violence, and all kinds of illegal activities. Murder, robbery, rape, and assault were daily occurrences. The city guard didn't care about poor neighborhoods. They only patrolled wealthy districts where their services were appreciated and paid for. In the slums, might made right, and vigilante justice was often the only form of order. Gangs controlled entire blocks and demanded protection money from residents. Those who didn't pay were beaten up, their apartments were set on fire, or they simply disappeared without a trace. So yeah, Roman housing for most people was an experience that was in no way inferior to modern slums, with the difference that it was normal then and there was no alternative. The absence of hope lets now talk about social services, or rather, their complete absence. There was no unemployment insurance, no health insurance, no pension, no social assistance. If you couldn't work, you had three options: beg, steal, or die. The concept of a society that cares for its weakest members was completely unknown. The state existed to make the rich richer and expand the empire, not to help people. Old people who could no longer work were often cast out by their own families because they represented a financial burden. They ended up on the streets and died there from hunger, disease, or violence. Life expectancy was low anyway, about 25-30 years for the average citizen, but those unlucky enough to grow old often faced only a miserable death. In a society where every day was a struggle for survival, there was no room for sentimental feelings toward useless mouths. Old people were seen as burdens who consumed valuable resources without giving anything back. Disabled people had even fewer chances. They were seen as a curse from the gods, and often exposed as infants. Those who reached adulthood with a disability could only hope to survive by begging or street performance. Many became objects of amusement, displayed as human curiosities in the houses of the rich. Wealthy Romans collected disabled people, like others collected curiosities, keeping them as entertainment for their guests. Widows and orphans were particularly vulnerable. Women often couldn't survive alone after their husbands' deaths, since they had no rights to conduct business or own property. Without male protection, they were at the mercy of any man's whims. Children who lost their parents usually ended up as street children or were sold into slavery. There were no orphanages, no adoption agencies, no state care. These children had to learn to survive on the streets, or they died. The only form of social assistance were the occasional grain distributions by the state, the famous bread and circuses. But these distributions were irregular, insufficient, and tied to political whims. They served mainly to prevent uprisings, not to really help. When an emperor was generous or needed popularity, there might be a distribution of free grain. But this was never guaranteed, never sufficient, and stopped as soon as political circumstances changed. In short, the Roman social system consisted of keeping people poor and desperate, so they had no energy for rebellion. The final verdict, let's be honest, we've only scratched the surface so far. Life in ancient Rome was a constant survival struggle where most people lost. The few who won did so at the cost of millions of others suffering. But maybe you're wondering, wasn't there anything positive about Roman life? The answer is complicated. Yes, there were moments of joy, beauty, human connection, but they were rare and precious precisely because they were so rare. A festival in honor of a god, where free food was distributed. A successful day at the market that brought in enough money to feed the family for a week. A moment of tenderness with a loved one, stolen between daily survival struggles. These moments existed, but they were bright spots in an otherwise dark and brutal existence. The Romans themselves were aware of the harshness of their lives. Their philosophy was shaped by Stoicism. The idea that one must suffer, and that the best thing one can do is endure this suffering with dignity. They didn't speak of happiness as life's goal, but of honor, duty, and acceptance of fate. Their literature was full of melancholy and despair. Their religion was obsessed with death and transience. Their art glorified violence and conquest. These weren't people who viewed life as beautiful or pleasant. They were people who had learned to endure the unbearable. And that's perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from ancient Rome. The people then weren't fundamentally different from us. They had the same needs, the same dreams, the same fears. But they lived in a system designed to suppress and ignore these human needs. The Roman Empire was efficient, powerful, and long-lasting, but it wasn't human. It was a machine for exploitation and oppression, wrapped in magnificent architecture and glorified through propaganda. Most people who lived in this system were nothing more than fuel for this machine. So when you next see a movie about the glorious Roman Empire, remember this. For every patrician in a white toga, there were hundreds of people living in poverty, fear, and despair. For every magnificent palace, there were thousands of crumbling insulae. For every triumphal procession, there were millions of dead, enslaved, and displaced people. That's the reality Hollywood doesn't show you. That's the story often overlooked in history books. That's the true face of the Roman Empire, not glamorous, not heroic, but brutal, inhuman, and shaped by a system that considered human suffering an acceptable price for power and wealth. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Many of the systems and structures that made Roman life so brutal still exist today in various forms. The extreme social hierarchies, the exploitation of the weak by the powerful, the glorification of violence, the treatment of people as replaceable resources. All of these are patterns that run through history and continue to this day. Ancient Rome isn't just history, it's a mirror that shows us where societies can lead when power and profit become more important than human dignity and compassion. It's a warning from the past that we ignore at our own risk. So yeah, would you survive more than one day in ancient Rome? Maybe, if you were strong enough, ruthless enough, and willing to sacrifice your humanity for bare survival. But the question isn't whether you could survive, the question is whether the life you'd have to lead would even be worth living. The Roman Empire shows us what happens when a civilization puts power over humanity, when it chooses efficiency over empathy, when it puts ends over means. It was a system that worked for a few by breaking many. It was an empire that demonstrated strength by exploiting weakness. It was a civilization that created order by bringing chaos into the lives of millions of people. And maybe that's why we still talk about ancient Rome today. Not because it was admirable, but because it reminds us what we don't want to become. It shows us the dark side of human nature, and the terrible things that can happen when this dark side gains the upper hand. Ancient Rome wasn't the end of history. It was a chapter in the long continuing story of human civilization, and like every chapter, it contains both lessons about what we can achieve, and warnings about what we should avoid. The people who lived and died in this brutal system weren't just statistics or historical figures, they were real people with real dreams, real fears, and real suffering. Their stories deserve to be told, not to glorify the system that oppressed them, but to honor their humanity and learn from their experiences. The average Roman got up every morning, hoping to survive the day. He fought against hunger, disease, violence, corruption, exploitation, and despair. He lived in constant fear of the next war, the next plague, the next collapse of the fragile structures that held his life together. But despite everything, he found ways to love, laugh, hope. He formed friendships despite mistrust, raised children despite dangers, created beauty despite the ugliness surrounding him. That's perhaps the true miracle of the human spirit. Not that we can create great empires, but that we can preserve our humanity even under the most inhuman circumstances. Roman history is full of such stories, of slaves who maintained their dignity, of soldiers who saved their comrades, of poor families who shared everything they had. These stories are rarely told because they don't fit the narrative of glorious Rome, but they're perhaps the most important of all. They remind us that history isn't just made by emperors and generals, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They show us that even in the darkest times, the human potential for goodness, courage, and hope never completely dies. Maybe that's why we still talk about them today. Not because we want to return to their world, but because we want to understand how far we've come, and how far we still have to go. The Roman Empire was a chapter in human history that we should study, understand, and ultimately transcend. You probably wouldn't last a day in ancient Rome. And you know what? That's probably a compliment to you. It means you grew up in a world that at least tries to respect human dignity and basic rights. It means you've developed compassion, empathy, and a sense of justice that would have been considered weakness in the Roman world. The Roman Empire was a survival test for the human species, and most people failed. But their stories, their suffering, their small acts of rebellion and humanity have taught us something important, that a civilization shouldn't be measured by its power, but by how it treats its weakest members. The Romans left us roads that still exist today, laws that still influence our jurisprudence, and a language that forms the basis for many modern languages. But perhaps their most important legacy is the warning. Look here. What happens when power becomes more important than humanity? You wouldn't last a day in the Roman Empire, and honestly, that's probably a good thing, because a world where most people can't last a day isn't a world worth preserving or recreating. It's a world that reminds us why we need to keep building something better, something more human, more just, and more worthy of the species that created it. So tonight, as you go to your comfortable bed, with clean water, safe food, and the protection of laws that actually protect you, remember the millions who never had these luxuries. Remember their struggles, their pain, and their resilience. And maybe, just maybe, use that memory as motivation to ensure that the world we're building today is one where everyone can survive, not just one day, but a lifetime filled with dignity, hope, and the chance to be truly human. This was your journey to ancient Rome, folks. A journey that reminds us that history isn't just facts and dates, but the stories of real people who lived real lives. Lives that were often shorter, harder, and more brutal than we can imagine. We've seen what an average day in ancient Rome looked like. From the moment of waking up in the stench of a crumbling insula, to the struggle to find enough food to survive another day. We've explored the brutality of work life, the arbitrariness of the legal system, the cruelty of medicine, the harshness of family life, the danger of the streets. We've seen how slavery destroyed the lives of millions, how war devastated the lives of soldiers and civilians alike, how poverty and disease trapped most people in a cycle of despair. But we've also seen that even under these inhuman conditions, human dignity and the human spirit couldn't be completely broken. People found ways to love, hope, dream, and fight for a better future. A future they might never see, but that their children or grandchildren might experience. That's the true lesson of ancient Rome. Not that power and conquest are admirable, but that the human capacity to survive, love and hope is stronger than any oppression. It's a lesson that's as relevant today as it was then. Thanks for listening, for taking this journey with me into a world so different, yet so similar to ours. And when you fall asleep tonight, maybe think for a moment about all the people who lived, suffered, and died before us so we could be here today. Sleep well, and never forget that history isn't just the past, but also the present and future. What we do today will determine whether future generations look back at us as another brutal chapter in human history, or as the moment we finally learned what it really means to be human. Good night, folks. May your dreams be more peaceful than the reality of those who came before us, and may we all work to create a world where no one has to just hope to survive another day. But before we close this chapter completely, let me paint you an even more detailed picture of what your daily survival would actually look like. Because what we've covered so far, that's just the appetizer to the main course of Roman brutality, the economics of desperation. Let's dive deeper into the economic reality that would crush your soul day after day. The Roman economy wasn't just unfair, it was a systematically rigged game, designed to funnel wealth upward while grinding everyone else into dust. Picture this: you're a small-time pottery maker trying to scratch out a living. Your workshop is a cramped, poorly ventilated hole that doubles as your living space. The clay you work with is of terrible quality, mixed with sand, debris, and sometimes human waste to bulk it up. Your pottery wheel is a rickety piece of junk that wobbles with every turn, making it nearly impossible to create anything of decent quality. But here's the kicker. You're competing against massive pottery operations run entirely by slaves. These slave-operated workshops can produce pottery at a fraction of the cost because, well, they don't have to pay their workers. They don't have to worry about worker safety, lunch breaks, or any of those pesky human considerations. They just work their slaves literally to death and replace them with new ones. So your pottery, which took you hours to make with your own hands, has to compete in the marketplace against pottery made by people who work 16-hour days without pay. How exactly are you supposed to price your goods competitively? You can't. Which means you're constantly on the verge of bankruptcy, desperately trying to undercut your own prices just to make enough money to buy moldy bread for dinner. And the customers? They don't give a damn about the craftsmanship or the human cost. They want the cheapest pottery available, period. If that means supporting slavery and putting free craftsmen out of business, so be it. The Roman consumer was as ruthless as the Roman economy itself. But wait, it gets worse. The wealthy elites didn't just compete with you, they actively worked to destroy small businesses like yours. Rich patricians would deliberately flood the market with below-cost goods just to drive independent craftsmen out of business. Once they destroyed the competition, they'd jack the prices back up and monopolize entire industries. This wasn't accidental market forces, this was economic warfare waged by the rich against everyone else. And there were no antitrust laws, no small business protections, no economic safety nets. If a wealthy Roman decided he wanted to own every pottery shop in the city, he could systematically destroy every small potter until he achieved that goal. The banking system was equally rigged. Interest rates for ordinary people were astronomical, often 50% to 100% per year. But if you were wealthy and well-connected, you could get loans at much lower rates. The rich got richer not just because they had money, but because the entire financial system was designed to give them every possible advantage. And speaking of loans, the debt collection methods would make modern loan sharks look like choir boys. Roman debt collectors didn't just repossess your property, they could literally enslave you and your entire family. Your wife, your children, even your elderly parents could be dragged off and sold in the slave markets to pay off your debts. There was no bankruptcy protection, no debt forgiveness, no fresh start provisions. Once you were in debt, you stayed in debt until you died or were enslaved. Many Romans took their own lives rather than face the horror of debt slavery, which was considered a perfectly reasonable response to financial ruin. The tax system was another layer of economic torture. Not only were taxes crushing and unpredictable, but the way they were collected was designed to maximize corruption and abuse. Tax farmers, the publicani, bid for the right to collect taxes in specific regions. Whatever they collected above their bid amount, they got to keep. This created a system where tax collectors had every incentive to squeeze every possible coin out of taxpayers. They would assess arbitrary fines, demand payments for made-up infractions, and extort money through pure intimidation. If you couldn't pay, they would confiscate your property, seize your family members, or have you beaten in the streets. The publicani operated like organized crime syndicates, with networks of enforcers, informants, and corrupt officials. They were so hated that tax collector became synonymous with traitor and scum in Roman society. But hatred didn't make them any less powerful or any less dangerous. The psychological warfare of daily life. Now, let's talk about something historians often overlook: the constant psychological pressure of living in Roman society. This wasn't just about physical survival, it was about maintaining your sanity in a world designed to drive you insane. Every social interaction was a potential landmine. You had to constantly calculate the relative status of everyone around you and adjust your behavior accordingly. Look the wrong person in the eye for too long. That's disrespect punishable by beating. Fail to show proper deference to someone of higher status. That's insolence that could get you killed. But here's the truly insidious part: the status markers were constantly changing and often deliberately unclear. The wealthy would modify their clothing, their hairstyles, their jewelry, their way of speaking to create subtle signals of rank that only insiders could interpret. This meant you were constantly guessing about how to behave around people, always at risk of making a fatal social error. The Romans had an entire vocabulary of subtle insults and status displays that could destroy your reputation without you even realizing what was happening. A slight change in how someone pronounced a word, a particular way of draping a toga, the specific angle at which someone held their head, all of these could convey messages of contempt or superiority that would mark you as a target for social destruction. And the gossip networks in Roman society were vicious and omnipresent. Your reputation could be destroyed by a single well-placed rumor, and once your social standing was damaged, it was nearly impossible to recover. People would spread lies about your sexual behavior, your business practices, your family history, your religious beliefs, anything that could be used to drag you down. The wealthy and powerful made a sport of destroying people's reputations. They had networks of clients and slaves, whose job it was to gather dirt on potential enemies and spread damaging stories throughout the city. Character assassination was considered a legitimate political and social tactic, but perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Roman life was the complete unpredictability of everything. You could go to bed as a free citizen and wake up as a slave if someone falsely accused you of a crime. You could be prosperous one day and destitute the next if a wealthy enemy decided to destroy your business. You could be respected in the morning and dead by evening if you accidentally offended the wrong person. This uncertainty created a constant state of anxiety that permeated every aspect of daily life. You couldn't make long-term plans because you had no guarantee you'd be alive or free to carry them out. You couldn't form deep friendships because anyone could betray you for personal advantage. You couldn't even trust your own family because family members regularly sold each other out for money or political favor. The psychological toll of living under these conditions was enormous. Many Romans developed what we would recognize today as severe anxiety disorders, depression, and paranoia. But there was no concept of mental health treatment, no understanding of psychological trauma, no support systems for people who were breaking down under the pressure. Instead, mental distress was seen as a sign of moral weakness or divine punishment. If you couldn't handle the stress of Roman life, that meant you were defective as a person. This created a vicious cycle where people who were already suffering psychologically were further marginalized and abused by society. The seasonal cycles of suffering. Let's talk about something that made Roman life even more hellish: the way suffering varied with the seasons, but never actually stopped. Winter in Rome was a special kind of hell. The insulae had no heating except for small dangerous braziers that killed as many people through carbon monoxide poisoning as they warmed. The thin walls and poor construction meant that winter wind cut through your living space like knives. You'd wake up with frost on your blankets, if you were lucky enough to have blankets. Food became even scarcer in winter. The primitive preservation methods meant that much of the stored grain and vegetables rotted before they could be consumed. What food was available was often moldy, worm-eaten, or otherwise contaminated. Many Romans spent the winter months in a state of semi-starvation, their bodies slowly consuming their own muscle and fat to stay alive. The lack of fresh food led to widespread scurvy, rickets, and other deficiency diseases. By the end of winter, much of the population looked like walking skeletons, pale, gaunt, covered in sores, with loose teeth and thinning hair. Children were particularly vulnerable, and winter infant mortality rates were astronomical. But winter also brought unique dangers. The poorly constructed insulae were more likely to collapse under the weight of snow and ice. Fires were more common as desperate people tried to stay warm with dangerous heating methods. The narrow, icy streets became death traps where a single slip could mean a fatal fall. And then there was the psychological impact of the long, dark winter months, with no artificial lighting beyond oil lamps and candles, both expensive luxuries for most people. Romans spent most of their winter evenings in near total darkness. Seasonal depression was rampant, though they had no name for it or understanding of what it was. Spring brought its own horrors. As the weather warmed, all the human and animal waste that had been frozen during winter began to thaw and rot. The stench was indescribable. Imagine the smell of months' worth of sewage, dead animals, and garbage all decomposing at once. The air became thick with disease-carrying insects that bred in the filth. Spring was also plague season. The combination of weakened immune systems from winter malnutrition, poor sanitation, and warming weather created perfect conditions for epidemic diseases. Cholera, typhus, dysentery, and other killers swept through the crowded neighborhoods like wildfire. Summer brought different but equally deadly challenges. The Mediterranean heat turned the insulae into ovens. The upper floors, where the poorest people lived, became so hot they were literally uninhabitable during midday. People would crowd into the streets and public areas seeking relief, creating massive crowds in the blazing sun. Dehydration and heat stroke killed thousands every summer. The public fountains and wells couldn't provide enough water for the massive population, and what water was available was often too contaminated to drink safely. People faced the choice between dying of thirst or dying of waterborne disease. The heat also accelerated food spoilage, making an already dangerous food supply even more deadly. Markets reeked of rotting meat and vegetables, but people had to buy and eat them anyway or starve. Summer food poisoning epidemics were as regular as the seasons themselves. Fall was harvest time, which you might think would bring relief. But for urban Romans, harvest season often meant even higher food prices as rural producers shipped their best crops to wealthy customers, while dumping their spoiled and inferior products on city markets. The brief abundance of fresh food was offset by sky-high prices that put decent nutrition out of reach for most people. Fall was also conscription season, when the army recruited new soldiers for the next year's campaigns. This meant that healthy young men were regularly torn from their families, just when their labor was most needed for surviving the coming winter. Families that lost their primary breadwinner to military service often didn't survive until his return, if he ever returned at all. The underground economy of survival now lets explore the vast criminal underworld that most Romans depended on for survival, because the legal economy simply couldn't support the majority of the population. Theft wasn't just common in Rome, it was practically a parallel economy. Professional thieves operated in organized gangs with specialized roles: pickpockets, burglars, armed robbers, fences, and corrupt officials who provided protection. These criminal organizations were often more reliable and better organized than legitimate businesses. But here's the thing: many Romans turned to crime not because they were inherently criminal, but because crime was often the only way to obtain necessities for survival. A father whose children were starving might steal bread. A mother whose baby was sick might rob a wealthy woman for money to buy medicine. These weren't career criminals, they were desperate people pushed beyond their limits. The penalties for theft were savage: amputation, flogging, crucifixion, being thrown to wild animals. But the alternative was watching your family slowly starve to death. For many Romans, the risk of horrific punishment was preferable to the certainty of slow death by poverty. Prostitution was another massive underground economy. Roman society was deeply hypocritical about sex. They simultaneously created enormous demand for sexual services while brutally punishing those who provided them. Prostitutes faced constant violence, disease, unwanted pregnancy, and social ostracism, but for many women, it was the only way to survive independently. Child prostitution was rampant and largely ignored by authorities. Orphan children, runaway slaves, and kids from destitute families were regularly forced into sexual slavery. The customers for these services included some of the most respectable men in Roman society: senators, wealthy merchants, military officers, even priests. The drug trade was another thriving criminal enterprise. Romans used various substances to escape the misery of their daily lives: opium, various fermented plant extracts, and other mind-altering substances. Drug dealers operated openly in many neighborhoods, protected by bribes to local officials. But the most pervasive criminal activity was corruption itself. Bribery wasn't just common, it was absolutely essential for navigating Roman society. You couldn't get permits, licenses, legal judgments, tax assessments, military exemptions, or any other official service without paying bribes. The entire governmental system was built on corruption. This created a shadow economy where your ability to survive depended not on your skills, hard work, or merit, but on your ability to pay bribes and cultivate corrupt relationships. Honest people were systematically disadvantaged and often destroyed by those willing to engage in criminal activity. The most successful Romans weren't necessarily the most talented or hardworking, they were the most ruthless and corrupt. This created a society where vice was rewarded and virtue was punished, where the people with the least moral scruples rose to the top while decent people were ground into dust. The technology of oppression. Let's talk about how Roman technology, often praised by historians, was actually designed to facilitate oppression and control rather than improve ordinary people's lives. Take those famous Roman roads, for instance. Yes, they were engineering marvels, but they were built primarily to move armies quickly and efficiently to suppress rebellions and maintain control over conquered territories. For ordinary Romans, these roads were often instruments of their own oppression. The roads made it easier for tax collectors to reach remote areas and squeeze money out of peasant farmers. They made it easier for slave catchers to pursue runaways. They made it easier for military recruiters to press young men into service. They facilitated the movement of grain and other resources from the provinces to Rome, often leaving local populations to starve. The famous Roman aqueducts tell a similar story. While they did bring water to cities, the distribution system was designed to benefit the wealthy first and foremost. Rich Romans had water piped directly to their homes, while poor people had to carry water from public fountains, assuming those fountains were working and the water wasn't contaminated. Moreover, the aqueducts were built with slave labor under conditions so brutal that they might as well have been death camps. Thousands of slaves died building each aqueduct, crushed by falling stones, drowned in construction accidents, or worked to death in dangerous conditions. The beautiful arches we admire today are monuments built on mass graves. Roman concrete and construction techniques enabled the building of massive structures like the Colosseum, but these structures were primarily designed for mass entertainment that celebrated violence and death. The engineering prowess that went into building amphitheaters for gladiatorial games could have been used to build hospitals, schools, or housing for the poor. Instead, it was used to create more efficient venues for public slaughter. Roman military technology was perhaps the most advanced in the world, but it was technology designed specifically for killing and conquering. Roman innovations in siege warfare, battlefield tactics, and weapons manufacturing were all focused on making it easier to destroy other societies and enslave their populations. Even Roman medical knowledge, such as it was primarily focused on keeping slaves and soldiers functional, rather than actually improving health outcomes. Roman military doctors became skilled at treating battlefield wounds not out of compassion, but because wounded soldiers were expensive to replace. Roman veterinarians were often better trained than doctors who treated humans, because horses were more valuable than people. The Romans developed sophisticated techniques for torture and execution, specialized tools, procedures, and methods designed to maximize pain and prolong death. They turned human suffering into a science, with experts who could keep someone alive and conscious while inflicting unimaginable agony for hours or even days. This technological sophistication in the service of cruelty extended to their economic systems as well. Romans developed complex financial instruments, accounting methods, and trade networks, but these innovations were primarily used to extract wealth from conquered territories and concentrated in the hands of a few Roman elites. The ecological catastrophe, here's something that rarely gets mentioned in discussions of Roman civilization: the environmental devastation caused by Roman expansion, and the ecological factors that made daily life even more miserable. Roman agriculture was extractive and unsustainable. They would conquer a territory, clear-cut its forests, strip-mine its minerals, and farm its soil until it was exhausted, then move on to the next region. This slash-and-burn approach to natural resources created ecological disasters across the Mediterranean world. Deforestation was particularly devastating. Romans cut down vast forests to fuel their heating systems, build their ships and buildings, and clear land for agriculture. This deforestation led to massive soil erosion, which silted up rivers and harbors, created floods and droughts, and turned fertile farmland into barren wasteland. The loss of forests also meant the loss of wildlife habitat, which reduced the availability of game animals that many people depended on for protein. It also disrupted local weather patterns, making agriculture even more unpredictable and dangerous. Roman mining operations were ecological disasters that poisoned water supplies and destroyed entire landscapes. They used hydraulic mining techniques that involved diverting rivers to blast away hillsides, leaving behind toxic waste that contaminated soil and water for generations. The mines themselves were hellscapes of poisoned air, contaminated water, and unstable terrain. But the ecological damage wasn't just happening in distant provinces, it was making life in Rome itself increasingly unlivable. The city grew far beyond what its local environment could support, requiring massive imports of food, water, and materials from across the empire. This put enormous pressure on transportation networks and made the city vulnerable to supply disruption. The Tiber River, which had once been a clear, clean waterway, became a toxic sewer that carried human waste, industrial runoff, and the debris of urban life. The air in Rome was thick with smoke from countless fires, the stench of human waste, and the dust kicked up by constant construction and traffic. Romans dealt with these environmental problems not by addressing their root causes, but by conquering new territories to exploit. When they had exhausted the easily accessible resources of one region, they would launch military campaigns to gain access to the resources of another region. This created an endless cycle of expansion, exploitation, and environmental destruction. The ecological damage also contributed to the spread of disease. Deforestation and environmental disruption drove disease-carrying animals and insects into closer contact with human populations. Contaminated water supplies spread cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne diseases. Poor air quality contributed to respiratory illnesses that killed thousands every year. Climate change. Yes, the Romans dealt with climate change too, made agriculture increasingly unreliable throughout the empire. Changing weather patterns led to droughts in some regions and floods in others, disrupting food supplies and contributing to famines that killed millions of people. But rather than adapting their practices to work with natural systems, Romans typically responded to ecological challenges by trying to dominate and control nature even more completely. They built bigger aqueducts, cleared more forests, mined more aggressively, and expanded their territorial control to access new resources. This approach worked in the short term but created long-term sustainability problems that eventually contributed to the empire's collapse. The Romans created a civilization that was fundamentally at war with the natural world, and that war ultimately consumed both the environment and the civilization itself. The cultural genocide. Let's spend some time on something that doesn't get nearly enough attention: the systematic destruction of local cultures that was central to Roman imperial policy. When Romans conquered a territory, they didn't just impose political control. They set out to completely obliterate the local culture and replace it with Roman culture. This wasn't an accidental byproduct of conquest. It was a deliberate policy designed to prevent resistance and ensure long-term control. The process began with language. Local languages were banned in official settings, schools, and legal proceedings. Children were forbidden to speak their native languages and were punished severely if caught doing so. Within a generation or two, entire languages disappeared as older speakers died, and younger people were forced to use Latin. But language was just the beginning. Romans systematically destroyed local literature, historical records, religious texts, and any other written materials that preserved indigenous culture. They burned libraries, destroyed monuments, and melted down cultural artifacts to use the materials for Roman projects. Local religions were particularly targeted for destruction. Roman authorities would desecrate temples, kill priests, and ban traditional religious practices. They often replaced local shrines with Roman temples, literally building their own religion on top of the ruins of indigenous spirituality. The destruction of local religions wasn't just about spiritual control. It was about destroying the social and cultural networks that held communities together. Religious festivals, ceremonies, and traditions provided the framework for community life, and by destroying these practices, Romans could break down local resistance and social cohesion. Educational systems were completely replaced with Roman schools that taught Roman history, Roman literature, Roman law, and Roman values. Local knowledge systems, traditional medicine, agricultural practices, craft techniques, storytelling traditions, were dismissed as primitive superstition and gradually lost. Roman authorities also engaged in what we would now call cultural appropriation on a massive scale. They would take elements of local culture, art styles, architectural techniques, religious imagery, literary themes, strip them of their original meaning and context, and incorporate them into Roman culture as Roman innovations. This cultural theft was particularly devastating because it meant that even when elements of local culture survived, they were disconnected from their original significance and turned into decorative elements in Roman imperial propaganda. The Romans also used intermarriage as a tool of cultural destruction. Roman men were encouraged to marry local women, but the children of these marriages were raised as Romans with no connection to their mother's cultural heritage. Over time, this diluted and eventually eliminated local bloodlines and cultural transmission. Economic policies were designed to destroy traditional ways of life and force people into the Roman economic system. Nomadic peoples were forced to settle in permanent villages. Subsistence farmers were forced into cash crop production for Roman markets. Traditional craft producers were driven out of business by Roman industrial operations. The psychological impact of this cultural genocide was enormous. People watched their entire way of life disappear within their own lifetimes. The languages they had learned as children became forbidden. The gods they had worshipped became illegal. The stories that had given meaning to their lives became forgotten. Many people experienced what we would now recognize as severe cultural trauma, a kind of psychological devastation that comes from having your entire cultural identity systematically destroyed. This trauma was passed down through generations, creating lasting psychological damage that persisted long after the original conquest. The mathematics of misery. Let's crunch some numbers to really understand the scale of human suffering we're talking about here. At its peak, the Roman Empire had a population of roughly 60 million people. Of those 60 million, historians estimate that only about 600,000, 1%, lived what we might consider comfortable lives. These were the imperial family, senators, wealthy patricians, and the most successful merchants and landowners. Another 2.3 million people, about 5% of the population, lived as middle-class Romans, prosperous craftsmen, small-scale merchants, low-level officials and military officers. These people weren't wealthy, but they had enough resources to live reasonably well most of the time. That leaves about 57 million people, 94% of the population, living in various degrees of poverty, oppression and misery. Of these, roughly 18 out of 20 million were slaves who had no legal rights and could be killed, tortured or abused at will. But even the free poor weren't really free in any meaningful sense. They lived under constant threat of enslavement, through debt, military conscription, or false criminal accusations. Their lives were controlled by landlords, employers, tax collectors and officials who had nearly absolute power over them. Let's break down what this meant in practical terms. About 45 million people lived in housing that would be considered uninhabitable by modern standards. About 50 million people were chronically malnourished and at constant risk of starvation. About 55 million people had no access to medical care
beyond primitive folk remedies.
About 54 million people were illiterate and had no access to education. About 50 million people worked in dangerous, physically demanding jobs with no safety protections. About 58 million people were subject to arbitrary violence from their social superiors. The mortality statistics are even more shocking. Average life expectancy in the Roman Empire was about 25 years. Infant mortality was roughly 50%. Half of all children died before their 5th birthday. Maternal mortality was about 50%. Half of all women died in childbirth or from childbirth-related complications. These weren't just statistics. They represent millions of individual tragedies. Families torn apart by death, children orphaned before they could walk, women dying in agony, trying to bring life into the world. Men worked to death in their prime. The economic numbers are equally devastating. Historians estimate that about 80% of the empire's wealth was controlled by the top 5% of the population. The bottom 50% of the population controlled less than 5% of the wealth. This level of economic inequality was so extreme that it made meaningful upward mobility virtually impossible for the vast majority of people. Consider what this meant for a typical Roman family. If you were a skilled craftsman, one of the better-paying jobs available to ordinary, you might earn enough to afford adequate food for your family about 200 days per year. The other 165 days, your family would go to bed hungry or eat food that was spoiled, contaminated, or nutritionally inadequate. If you got sick and couldn't work for even a week, your family would face serious hardship. If you were injured and couldn't work for a month, your family might lose their housing and end up on the streets. If you died unexpectedly, your family would almost certainly face destitution, slavery, or death. These numbers help explain why Roman society was so brutal and why people seemed so callous toward human suffering. When the vast majority of people lived on the edge of disaster, compassion became a luxury that few could afford. Helping others often meant condemning yourself and your own family to suffering. The scale of human misery in the Roman Empire was so vast that it's difficult for modern people to comprehend. We're talking about tens of millions of people living in conditions that would be considered severe human rights abuses today, generation after generation for hundreds of years. This wasn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect of Roman civilization. It was the foundation that Roman civilization was built on. The wealth, power, and cultural achievements that we associate with Rome were extracted from the blood, sweat, and lives of these millions of suffering people. So yeah, when someone talks about the glory of Rome, or the greatness of Roman civilization, remember these numbers. Remember that for every marble statue, there were thousands of slaves who quarried the stone. For every triumph parade, there were millions of conquered people whose lives were destroyed. For every elegant Roman villa, there were tens of thousands of people crammed into disease-ridden slums. The true measure of a civilization isn't its monuments or its military victories. It's how it treats the most vulnerable members of society. By that measure, the Roman Empire was one of history's greatest failures, a cautionary tale about what happens when power becomes more important than humanity. This concludes our extended journey through the hellscape that was daily life in ancient Rome. Thank you for staying with me through this detailed exploration of human suffering and resilience. Sleep well, and remember, we've come a long way, but we still have far to go to build a world truly worthy of human dignity.